Picture this. It's 230 BC and you're a Roman merchant about to embark on what should be a routine trading voyage across the Mediterranean. You've loaded your ship with the finest wine from Campania, olive oil that could make a Greek philosopher weep with joy, and enough grain to feed a small army. Because let's face it, Romans loved their bread almost as much as they loved conquering things. The Mediterranean Sea was ancient Rome's highway to riches, connecting the great cities of Rome, Athens, Carthage, and Alexandria like a watery superhighway of commerce. Roman merchant ships, heavy with treasures from across the known world, sailed these waters with the confidence of people who hadn't yet met their match. But here's the thing about confidence. It has a way of attracting exactly the kind of trouble you're trying to avoid. Because beneath the serene surface of Mediterranean prosperity lurked a menace that would make even the bravest Roman captain consider a career change. Merchants didn't just whisper about pirates. They had full-blown anxiety attacks about them. These weren't your typical yo-ho and a bottle of wine, raiders stumbling around drunk on stolen goods. Oh no, these pirates operated with military precision, strategic brilliance, and a level of organization that would make a Roman general take notes. And at the helm of this maritime nightmare stood a woman who would become Rome's most feared enemy. Not through luck, not through chance, but through sheer, calculated brilliance. Her name was Teuta, Queen of Illyria, and she was about to teach Rome that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. To understand how one woman could bring Rome to its knees, we need to take a little field trip to Illyria. Now, if you're imagining some peaceful seaside kingdom where everyone sips wine and discusses philosophy, think again. Illyria was located along what we now call the Western Balkans, modern-day Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, and parts of Croatia. It was a land where the mountains were as sharp as the politics, and trust me, Illyrian politics could cut glass. You see, the Illyrians weren't just one big happy tribe living in harmony. Oh no, they were a collection of fiercely independent tribes with names like the Ardoi, Dalmatia, and Liburni, each with their own chiefs, their own territories, and their own very creative ways of settling disputes. Think of it as Game of Thrones, but with better boats and more practical armor. These people were born sailors. While Romans were still figuring out which end of an oar goes in the water, Illyrians were building some of the fastest, most maneuverable ships in the ancient world. The Liburnians, sleek, lightweight vessels perfect for a hit-and-run tactics, were so effective that Rome would later steal the design for their own navy, because nothing says we respect your culture quite like copying your military technology. But here's what made Illyrian society truly unique. Survival wasn't just about individual strength. It was about knowing when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to disappear into the mountains faster than your enemies could say tax collection. Women in Illyrian society held considerably more power than their counterparts in Rome or Greece. They could own property, inherit wealth, and, as we'll see, rule kingdoms with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. Now about that piracy thing, let's clear up one misconception. Illyrian piracy wasn't some chaotic free-for-all where drunk sailors randomly attacked whoever looked profitable. It was a highly organized, seasonal occupation that followed strict customs and unwritten rules. Think of it as aggressive maritime taxation almost. During sailing season, Illyrian ships would patrol trade routes, demanding tribute from passing merchants. Pay up and you sailed safely to your destination. Refuse, and your cargo became part of the Illyrian redistribution program. The Romans, of course, called this piracy. The Illyrians called it a regular Tuesday. Enter King Agron, Teuta's husband and the man who first put Illyria on Rome's radar in a big way. Agron wasn't just any tribal chief, he was the king who united the Ardoi tribe and turned them into a regional powerhouse. Under his rule, the Illyrian navy grew from a collection of fishing boats with delusions of grandeur into a formidable fleet that could challenge anyone in the Adriatic. You see, Agron had a particular talent for what we might diplomatically call aggressive expansion. In 231 BC, he decided to help the people of Medion against the Aetolians, not out of altruism, mind you, but because a good war is excellent for business. His forces didn't just win, they absolutely demolished the Aetolians in a victory so complete that Agron threw a celebration that would make a Roman triumph look like a quiet dinner party. But here's where the story takes a turn worthy of a Greek tragedy. Agron celebrated so hard that he literally drank himself to death. not unlike Alexander the Great. Now, ancient sources disagree on the exact cause. Some say it was excessive celebration, others whisper about poison, and still others suggest he had what we now recognize as a heart attack brought on by extreme excitement. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Illyria suddenly needed new leadership, and fast. And this is where our story gets interesting. Because in most ancient societies, the death of a king meant civil war, political chaos, and generally the succession crisis that makes modern politics look civilized. But Agron had made one very smart decision during his reign. He had married Teuta. Now, ancient sources don't tell us much about Teuta's early life, because let's face it, ancient historians were about as interested in women's biographies as Elon Musk is in paying taxes. But what we can piece together suggests that Teuta wasn't just some pretty face who happened to marry well. She was Agron's political partner, his strategic advisor, and quite possibly the brains behind many of his military successes. While Agron was out conquering territories and making grand speeches, Teuta was mastering the far more difficult art of Illyrian politics, learning which tribal leaders could be trusted, which ones needed to be watched, and which ones should be eliminated before they became a problem. She understood that in Illyria, survival depended not just on military might, but on the ability to navigate a political landscape more treacherous than the rocky Adriatic coastline. Picture the scene. The most powerful king in Illyria is dead, leaving behind a power vacuum that could tear the kingdom apart. Various tribal leaders are eyeing the throne like hungry wolves around a fresh kill. There's Agron's infant son Pins, who has the legitimate claim, but also has the political influence of a particularly unremarkable houseplant. There are ambitious nobles ready to start a civil war that would make the later Roman civil wars look like a polite disagreement. And then there's Teuta, the queen widow who stepped forward and basically said, "Hold my wine, I've got this." Teuta's rise to power was a masterclass in political maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli, if Machiavelli had been born about 1700 years earlier and had access to a navy. She moved quickly to secure the loyalty of key tribal leaders through a combination of strategic promises, well-timed marriages arranged for her supporters, not herself, and the occasional demonstration that crossing the new queen would be hazardous to one's potential health. She officially ruled as regent for the young Pines, but everyone understood that Teuta was really calling the shots. And her first major decision as ruler? She looked at the Illyrian navy that Agron had built and thought, you know what this needs? Better organization, stricter discipline, and a lot more ambition. Under Teuta's leadership, Illyrian piracy transformed from a cottage industry into what we might today call a maritime protection racket with excellent customer service. Her admirals didn't just randomly attack ships. They studied trade routes, identified the most profitable targets, and developed tactics that would have made Sun Tzu proud. The queen understood something that many ancient rulers missed. Control of the sea meant control of trade, and control of trade meant control of power. While other kingdoms fought over scraps of land, Teuta was building an empire based on maritime dominance. Every merchant ship that paid tribute to avoid attack was essentially paying taxes to Queen Teuta's government in exile. But here's what made Teuta's approach truly revolutionary. She didn't just want to raid Roman ships. She wanted to challenge Rome's assumption that the Mediterranean was their private lake. Now let's take a moment to appreciate just how sophisticated Teuta's piracy operation really was. You see, this wasn't just a bunch of desperate sailors hoping to get lucky. This was a naval organization that would have made the later Roman admiralty jealous. First, there was the intelligence gathering. Teuta's agents operated in major ports throughout the Mediterranean, collecting information about cargo manifests, departure times, and the defensive capabilities of merchant vessels. They knew which ships carried the most valuable goods, which routes were least defended, and when Roman naval patrols were likely to be elsewhere. Then there was the technology. Illyrian Liburnians were the sports cars of the ancient world, fast, agile, and perfect for hit-and-run attacks. While Roman merchant ships were built like floating warehouses, stable but slow, Illyrian vessels could literally sail circles around them. A typical attack would involve multiple Liburnians approaching from different directions, making resistance futile and escape impossible. But here's the really clever part. Teuta's pirates rarely had to fight. The reputation of Illyrian naval superiority was so well established that most merchants preferred to pay tribute rather than risk losing their entire cargo and possibly their lives in a hopeless battle. It was ancient maritime insurance, with Teuta as the insurance company. A typical encounter might go something like this. A Roman merchant ship loaded with Egyptian grain and Gallic silver spots Illyrian Liburnians on the horizon. The captain, who's been through this before, orders his crew to prepare the tribute payment, usually about 10% of the cargo's total value. The Illyrians approach, their leader boards the merchant vessel, inspects the cargo, accepts the payment, and wishes the Romans a pleasant voyage. Professional, courteous, and profitable for everyone involved. Well, everyone except Rome, which was losing a fortune in tribute payments and starting to take the whole situation rather personally. Now, let's shift perspective to Rome, where senators were discovering that ruling the Mediterranean wasn't quite as easy as they thought it'd be. Roman trade was the lifeblood of the Republic. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, silk from the East, and wine from literally everywhere because Romans had their priorities straight. When Illyrian pirates started treating Roman merchant ships like their personal ATMs, it created what economists would now call significant market disruption. The numbers were absolutely staggering. Roman merchants were losing millions of denarii annually to tribute payments and cargo seizures. Insurance costs for Mediterranean voyages skyrocketed. Some trade routes became so dangerous that merchants simply stopped using them, creating shortages in Rome that led to higher prices and very unhappy citizens. And here's something that ancient sources don't always emphasize. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a political crisis. Roman power was built on the promise that Rome could protect its allies and trading partners. And when Illyrian pirates started attacking ships from Greek cities that were supposed to be under Roman protection, it made Rome look weak, ineffective, and possibly irrelevant. And nothing terrified Roman politicians more than looking irrelevant. They could handle military defeats, economic setbacks, even the occasional barbarian invasion. But threats to Roman prestige? Now that was war declaration territory. The pressure on the Roman Senate was enormous. Merchant guilds were demanding action, allied cities were questioning Roman protection, and Roman citizens were starting to ask uncomfortable questions like, if we can't handle a few pirates, how exactly are we planning to conquer the, whole entire world? The senators tried diplomatic solutions first, because Romans, for all their reputation for violence, actually preferred to solve problems with strongly worded letters when possible. They sent embassies to various Illyrian leaders, demanding an end to attacks on Roman shipping. The responses they received were less than satisfactory. Most Illyrian chiefs basically replied with variations of, we're not attacking Roman ships specifically, we're just providing maritime security services to all vessels in our territorial waters. If Rome doesn't like our fees, they're welcome to provide their own security, which was ancient diplomatic speak for, come and stop us if you can. In 230 BC, Rome decided to try the direct approach. They sent an embassy directly to Queen Teuta, led by two prominent Romans, Gaius and Lucius Coruncanius. Now, these weren't just any random Roman senators. They represented the full authority of the Roman Republic, and their mission was simple: convince Queen Teuta to stop the piracy, or else. The meeting between the Roman envoys and Queen Teuta has become one of those legendary diplomatic encounters that historians love to analyze, mainly because it demonstrates what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object, with both sides speaking different languages, literally and figuratively. The Romans arrived expecting to negotiate with what they assumed was a typical barbarian queen, someone who could be impressed by Roman authority, intimidated by Roman threats, or bought off with Roman gold. What they found instead was a ruler who was unimpressed by their credentials, unintimidated by their threats, and definitely not interested in their gold. The Roman envoys delivered their demands with all the diplomatic subtlety of a brick through a window: cease all attacks on Roman shipping, compensate merchants for their losses, and submit to Roman authority in maritime matters. Essentially, they were asking Queen Teuta to dismantle her entire power base and turn Illyria into a Roman client state. Obviously, Teuta's response has been preserved by ancient historians, and it's a masterpiece of diplomatic defiance. It is not the custom of the Illyrians to prevent their people from enriching themselves at sea. Now, this might sound like a simple statement, but it was actually a brilliantly crafted piece of political theater. Teuta was essentially saying three things at once. First, that piracy was an ancient Illyrian tradition that Rome had no right to interfere with. Second, that her people had every right to make a living from the sea, regardless of Roman objections. And third, most importantly, that she didn't recognize or care for Roman authority over Illyrian affairs. It was the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Thanks for your opinion, now get off my lawn." The Roman envoys were not amused, obviously. They had expected submission, negotiation, or at least some recognition of Roman superiority. What they got instead was a lecture on Illyrian maritime traditions from a woman who clearly didn't understand how important they were. According to ancient sources, the younger Coruncanius' brother lost his temper completely. He apparently told Queen Teuta that Rome would teach her people better customs and that she would soon learn to respect Roman power, which was probably not the best diplomatic strategy when dealing with the queen who commanded one of the most effective navies in the Mediterranean. What happened next depends on which ancient source you believe, but the result was the same. The younger Coruncanius' brother was killed. Some sources say he was assassinated on Teuta's direct orders. Others suggest he was killed by angry Illyrian nobles who were insulted by his threats. Still others claim it was an accident during a heated argument that got out of hand. But regardless of the exact circumstances, the diplomatic mission ended with a dead Roman envoy, which was pretty much the ancient equivalent of declaring war via express mail. When news of the envoy's death reached Rome, the reaction was, well, imagine telling a group of Roman senators that not only had their demands been rejected, but that their representative had been killed for good measure. The Senate went from diplomatic frustration to righteous fury faster than you can say casus belli. The killing of a Roman envoy wasn't just an insult, it was a violation of one of the most sacred principles of ancient diplomacy. Envoys were supposed to be inviolate, protected by divine law and international custom. Their murder was considered one of the few acts that automatically justified war, regardless of other circumstances. Rome's response was characteristically thorough and overwhelmingly massive. They didn't just declare war on Illyria, they declared total war. The Senate authorized the recruitment of additional legions, the construction of a massive fleet, and the mobilization of resources on a scale that hadn't been seen since the Punic Wars. The Roman plan was elegantly simple. Use overwhelming force to crush Illyrian resistance so completely that no other potential enemy would ever consider challenging Roman authority again. It was to be a demonstration of Roman power that would echo throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans appointed 2 consuls to lead the expedition, Gnaeus Fulvius Centimallus and Aulus Postumius Albinus. These weren't inexperienced politicians playing a war. They were seasoned military commanders who understood that fighting Illyrians would require different tactics than fighting other enemies. The Roman strategy involved a 2-pronged approach: a naval blockade to cut off Illyrian sea-based power, combined with land-based attacks on key Illyrian cities. The goal was to force Teuta to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, preventing her from concentrating her forces effectively. But the Romans also understood that this wouldn't be a conventional war. Illyrians were guerrilla fighters who knew their territory intimately and could disappear into the mountains faster than Roman legions could follow. Victory would require not just military success, but also political cunning to turn Illyrian tribes against each other. The First Illyrian War began in 229 BC, and it immediately became clear that this would be unlike any conflict Rome had fought before. The Romans were used to fighting enemies who would meet them in open battle, where superior discipline and tactics could decide the outcome quickly. But the Illyrians had other ideas. Teuta's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Avoid direct confrontation with Roman legions while using naval superiority to harass Roman supply lines and launch surprise attacks on vulnerable targets. It was asymmetric warfare at its finest, using mobility and local knowledge to offset the enemy's numerical and technological advantages. The war's first major engagement came at Corcyra, modern Corfu, where Roman forces laid siege to an Illyrian garrison. The siege demonstrated both Roman engineering capabilities and Illyrian tactical flexibility. While Roman siege engines pounded the walls, Illyrian ships attempted to break the naval blockade and resupply the defenders. The battle for Corcyra lasted for weeks, with both sides showing remarkable determination. Roman accounts describe Illyrian defenders who fought with barbarian fury, while Illyrian sources preserved in later Greek histories describe Roman attackers who advanced like machines of war, immune to fear or pity. The naval engagements were particularly brutal. Roman triremes were larger and more heavily armed, but Illyrian Liburnians were faster and more maneuverable. A typical battle would see Roman ships trying to ram or board Illyrian vessels, while the Illyrians used hit-and-run tactics to avoid direct confrontation. But here's where Teuta's organizational genius really showed. Her naval commanders were in constant communication, coordinating their attacks to maximize damage while minimizing losses. Roman accounts describe Illyrian fleets that seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking Roman supply convoys and then vanishing before Roman warships could respond. But as the war progressed, Roman military superiority began to tell. Despite Illyrian tactical brilliance, Rome's advantages in manpower, resources, and siege technology gradually overwhelmed Illyrian defenses. One by one, coastal cities fell to Roman assault, and Teuta's naval bases were captured or destroyed. But the Romans quickly learned that conquering Illyrian cities was a lot easier than holding them. Illyrian guerrilla fighters operating from mountain bases launched constant raids on Roman garrisons. Roman supply lines were under constant attack, and Roman commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to stay defeated. While Roman legions were fighting Illyrian warriors, Roman diplomats were waging an equally important battle for Illyrian hearts and minds. The Romans understood that military victory alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to break the political coalition that kept Teuta in power. The Roman strategy involved identifying Illyrian tribes that were either neutral or hostile to Teuta's rule, then offering them better terms for switching sides. It was a classic divide and conquer tactic, and it worked because Illyrian politics were even more complicated than Roman politics, which is really saying something. Several factors worked in Rome's favor. First, not all Illyrian tribes had benefited equally from Teuta's piracy operations. Some inland tribes received little of the wealth generated by maritime raiding and resented being dragged into a war with Rome. Second, some tribal leaders saw Roman victory as inevitable and wanted to be on that winning side when the dust settled. But most importantly, Rome offered something that Teuta couldn't: the promise of peaceful, profitable trade relationships with the broader Mediterranean world. For tribes whose economies depended on more than just piracy, Roman promises of commercial partnerships were genuinely attractive. The turning point came when several major tribal leaders switched sides, bringing their warriors and naval forces with them. Suddenly, Teuta found herself not just fighting Romans, but also former allies who knew her tactics, her bases, and her weaknesses. This was the ancient equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover, except instead of stock options, the negotiations involved swords, ships, and the occasional ritual sacrifice. The message was clear, though. Resistance to Rome was futile, but cooperation with Rome could be very, very profitable. By 228 BC, Teuta's position had become impossible. Her naval forces were scattered or destroyed, her cities were under Roman occupation, and her political coalition had collapsed. Faced with the choice between total destruction and negotiated surrender, she chose to negotiate. The terms of Teuta's surrender were harsh, but not vindictive by Roman standards. She was allowed to keep her title and a small territory around her capital, but her naval forces were disbanded, piracy was outlawed, and Illyria became a Roman protectorate. Most humiliatingly for a queen who had built her power on maritime dominance, Teuta was forbidden from sailing south of Lissus with more than 2 unarmed ships. The Treaty of 228 BC essentially ended Illyrian independence, but it also established a template for Roman expansion throughout the Mediterranean. Rather than simply destroying conquered enemies, Rome preferred to transform them into client states that could provide troops, tribute, and strategic bases for future campaigns. For Teuta personally, the treaty represented the end of her dreams of Illyrian empire, but not necessarily the end of her story. Roman sources suggest that she was allowed to retire with dignity, retaining her royal title and a comfortable lifestyle. Whether this was genuine Roman magnanimity or simple practical politics is debatable. The First Illyrian War had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. For Rome, it represented the first major expansion into the eastern Mediterranean and established precedents for dealing with maritime enemies. For the Illyrians, though, it marked the end of their independence and the beginning of centuries of foreign rule. Perhaps most importantly, the war demonstrated something that would become a recurring theme in Roman history: Rome's ability to learn from its enemies and adapt their tactics for Roman use. Within a generation, Roman naval forces would be using modified Illyrian ships, designs, and tactics, turning Teuta's innovations against her successors. Here's where Teuta's story takes on an almost mythical quality, though, because ancient sources disagree about what happened to her after that treaty. Some Roman historians claim she died quietly in retirement, accepting her defeat with stoic dignity. Greek sources suggest she may have been assassinated by rivals who blamed her for Illyria's downfall. And Illyrian legends, preserved in later folktales, tell stories of a queen who never truly surrendered. The most intriguing possibility is that Teuta spent her final years plotting a comeback. Roman records mention several minor rebellions in Illyria during the 220s BC, led by commanders who may have been acting on her orders. These uprisings were quickly suppressed, but they suggest that reports of Teuta's political death may have been greatly exaggerated. There's also evidence that Teuta may have maintained a network of supporters throughout the whole entire eastern Mediterranean, continuing to influence events even after her official defeat. Piracy didn't disappear from the Adriatic after 228 BC. It just became a lot more careful about avoiding Roman attention. Some historians speculate that Teuta transformed from an open enemy of Rome into a covert operator, using her knowledge of Mediterranean politics to support anti-Roman activities throughout the region. If true, it would mean that her surrender was not an admission of defeat, but a strategic retreat, allowing her to continue fighting Rome through proxies and allies. What we do know is that Teuta's reputation outlived her physical presence. Throughout the Roman period, her name became synonymous with successful resistance to Roman power. Later rebellions against Rome in the Balkans often invoked her memory, and commanders were claimed to be following in her footsteps. This legendary status probably tells us more about how people remember Teuta than about what she actually accomplished after her defeat. But it also suggests that her impact on Mediterranean politics extended far beyond her actual reign, influencing events and inspiring resistance movements for generations after her death. So what should we make of Queen Teuta's extraordinary life and career? On one level, she was simply another ancient ruler who challenged Rome and lost, hardly unique in Mediterranean history. But on another level, she represents something much more significant: proof that Roman expansion wasn't inevitable, that intelligent opposition could force Rome to adapt and change its strategies. Teuta's greatest achievement wasn't her military victories or her political successes. It was demonstrating that Rome could be challenged by someone who understood Roman weaknesses and exploited them systematically. Her piracy campaign forced Rome to develop new naval capabilities, new diplomatic strategies, and new approaches to governing conquered territories. From a military perspective, Teuta was centuries ahead of her time. Her use of intelligence networks, coordinated fleet operations, and guerrilla tactics wouldn't look out of place in a modern military manual. She understood that traditional warfare, meeting the enemy in an open battle, would play to Roman strengths. So she developed alternatives that maximized her advantages while minimizing Roman ones. Her political achievements were equally impressive. In a world where women rarely held independent power, she built and maintained a coalition of tribal leaders who were traditionally impossible to unite. She managed to keep this coalition together for years while under constant pressure from both external enemies and internal rivals. Modern historians continue to debate Teuta's historical significance. Some see her as an early example of asymmetric warfare, demonstrating how smaller powers can challenge larger ones through superior strategy and tactics. Others view her as a transitional figure, representing the last gasp of Illyrian independence before Roman dominance became inevitable. What's not debatable is her impact on Roman development. The First Illyrian War forced Rome to become a Mediterranean naval power, develop new diplomatic strategies, and create administrative systems for governing distant territories. In many ways, fighting Teuta taught Rome how to become an empire, rather than just a powerful city-state. Recent archaeological discoveries have also revised our understanding of Illyrian society during Teuta's reign. Far from being barbarians as Roman sources claimed, the Illyrians had developed sophisticated urban centers, complex trade networks, and advanced military technologies. Teuta wasn't ruling over a collection of primitive tribes. She was leading a genuinely advanced civilization that happened to have different values than Rome. The discovery of Illyrian coins bearing Teuta's image, some of the earliest coins to feature a female ruler, suggests that her authority was widely recognized and that she had developed sophisticated economic policies. These weren't the actions of a simple pirate queen, but of a ruler who understood statecraft, economics, and international relations. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in ancient history: the problem of sources. Almost everything we know about Teuta comes from Roman and Greek historians who had very specific reasons for portraying her in particular ways. And spoiler alert, those reasons weren't always about historical accuracy. Roman historians like Polybius and Livy had a narrative to maintain, that Roman expansion was justified, inevitable, and beneficial for everyone involved. In this narrative, enemies of Rome needed to be portrayed as either incompetent buffoons who deserved to lose, or dangerous barbarians who needed to be stopped for the good of civilization. Teuta was too competent to be dismissed as incompetent, so she became a dangerous barbarian. Now this is where things get interesting from a historiographical perspective. Greek sources, particularly those from cities that had been attacked by Illyrian pirates, generally portrayed Teuta as a ruthless tyrant who terrorized innocent merchants. Roman sources emphasized her violation of diplomatic norms and her challenge to Roman authority. But later sources, particularly those from the Eastern Mediterranean, sometimes portrayed her more sympathetically as a defender of her people's traditional way of life. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Teuta was likely a pragmatic ruler who used the tools available to her, including piracy, to maintain Illyrian independence and prosperity. From her perspective, Roman merchants were foreign intruders who should pay for the privilege of sailing through Illyrian waters. From Rome's perspective, she was a criminal who threatened international commerce. What's fascinating is how modern archaeology has begun to fill in gaps left by ancient sources. Excavations at sites like Rizon and Skodra have revealed evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgy, and extensive trade networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean. These discoveries suggest that Illyrian society under Teuta was far more complex and developed than Roman sources implied. We've also found evidence of female political authority that was much more common in Illyrian society than in Rome or Greece at this time. Inscriptions mentioning female magistrates, property owners, and religious leaders suggest that Teuta's rise to power wasn't as unusual in Illyrian context as it would have been elsewhere. And to fully appreciate Teuta's significance, we need to zoom out and look at the broader Mediterranean context of the 3rd century BC. This was a world in transition, where the old balance of power established after Alexander the Great's death was breaking down, and new powers were emerging to fill that vacuum. In the West, Rome was still recovering from the First Punic War with Carthage, and was just beginning to look beyond Italy for expansion opportunities. In the East, the Hellenistic kingdoms were weakening through constant warfare and internal strife. In the South, Ptolemaic Egypt was still wealthy but increasingly focused on internal affairs. It was a world ripe for disruption, and Teuta represented one of several attempts to create new power centers outside the traditional great power structure that was already in place. What made Teuta's challenge to Rome particularly significant was its timing. If she had emerged just 50 years earlier, Rome might not have had the resources to respond effectively. If she had emerged 50 years later, Roman dominance might have been too well established to challenge. But in 230 BC, Rome was strong enough to fight, but not yet strong enough to simply ignore challenges to its authority. This timing also explains why the Roman response was so overwhelming. Rome was at a crucial moment in its expansion, where demonstrating weakness could have encouraged other potential enemies to challenge Roman authority. The destruction of Teuta's power wasn't just about stopping piracy. It was about sending a message to every other Mediterranean ruler that challenging Rome would be a fatal mistake. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Teuta wasn't the only powerful woman in the 3rd century BC Mediterranean. Cleopatra I of Egypt, Demetrius of Macedonia, and several other queens held significant political power during this period. What made Teuta unique wasn't her gender, but her willingness to challenge Rome directly through military action rather than diplomatic maneuvering. This also suggests that Teuta's story reflects broader patterns in Hellenistic political culture, where royal women often held more authority than their counterparts in earlier periods. Her rise to power was unusual, but not unprecedented, and her methods were innovative but built on existing traditions of female leadership in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now let's dive deeper into what made Teuta's military strategy just so effective, because this is where she really earned her reputation as one of the ancient world's most innovative military leaders. Her approach to naval warfare was revolutionary, combining traditional Illyrian seamanship with new organizational methods that wouldn't look out of place in a modern navy. First, there was communications. Teuta's fleets used a sophisticated system of signals, flags by day, fires by night, that allowed coordinated attacks across wide areas. Roman sources describe Illyrian fleets that seemed to act as a single organism, with individual ships responding to distant commands faster than should have been possible with ancient communication methods. Then there was technology. The Illyrian Liburnian wasn't just fast, it was specifically designed for the kind of warfare that Teuta preferred. Shallow draft meant it could operate in coastal waters where larger Roman ships couldn't follow. Multiple steering oars provided exceptional maneuverability, and a streamlined design allowed it to accelerate quickly, essential for hit-and-run tactics. But here's what Roman sources sometimes miss. These ships weren't just built for piracy. They were designed for asymmetric warfare against a superior enemy. Every single design feature served a strategic purpose, from the reinforced prow for ramming attacks to the low profile that made them harder to spot from a distance. Teuta also revolutionized naval training. Unlike most ancient navies where crews learned on the job, Illyrian sailors underwent systematic training in specific maneuvers. Roman accounts describe Illyrian attacks that were executed with unnatural precision, suggesting a level of drill and discipline that most ancient navies lacked. This training focused on coordination between multiple ships, rapid deployment from hidden anchorages, and the ability to switch quickly between different tactical formations depending on circumstances. It was the ancient equivalent of special forces training designed to maximize the effectiveness of smaller numbers against larger enemies. Strategically, Teuta understood something that many ancient commanders missed. Controlling space is more important than controlling territory. Rather than trying to hold specific cities or regions, she focused on controlling the sea lanes that connected them. By dominating those key shipping routes, she could effectively strangle the economic life of much larger territories without having to conquer them directly. This approach required perfect timing and intelligence, both of which Teuta provided through her network of agents and informants. Her forces always seemed to know exactly when and where the most valuable targets would be vulnerable, suggesting an intelligence operation that would have impressed modern spy agencies. While military historians focus on battles and tactics, Teuta's real genius lay in understanding economic warfare. She wasn't just stealing cargo, she was systematically disrupting the financial networks that held the Roman world together. And in an economy that depended entirely on maritime trade, this was economic warfare at its most effective. Consider the mathematics. A successful merchant voyage might generate profits of 100% or more, but those profits were calculated against the assumption of safe passage. When Teuta's pirates started demanding 10 to 20% tribute from every single ship, they weren't just reducing profits, they were making many trading ventures economically unviable. But the real economic damage came from uncertainty. Merchants could budget for tribute payments if they were predictable, but Teuta's forces deliberately varied their demands to maximize psychological impact. Sometimes they would take tribute and provide safe passage. Sometimes they would take tribute and still seize part of the cargo. Sometimes they would demand additional payments based on the cargo's value or the ship's destination. This uncertainty forced Roman merchants to factor much higher risk premiums into their pricing, which drove up costs throughout the Mediterranean economy. Grain prices in Rome rose not just because of direct losses to piracy, but because merchants had to charge more to compensate for the increased risks of Mediterranean trade. The economic warfare also extended to credit markets. Roman merchants often financed their voyages through loans secured against expected cargo values. When piracy made those cargoes unreliable, credit became more expensive and harder to obtain. This created a cascading effect throughout the whole entire Roman economy, affecting everyone from wealthy investors to small shopkeepers. Teuta understood that economic pressure could be more effective than military pressure in forcing political change. Roman politicians might ignore distant military defeats, but they couldn't ignore angry citizens complaining about rising food prices and reduced trade opportunities. The conflict between Rome and Teuta wasn't just military and economic, it was also a propaganda war that would influence how both cultures were remembered by history. Roman artists and writers immediately began creating cultural products that justified Roman intervention by portraying Illyrians as savage pirates who threatened civilized commerce. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It justified the enormous expense of the Illyrian wars to Roman taxpayers, provided moral legitimacy for Roman expansion into new territories, and created cultural narratives that would be used to justify future conquests. Teuta became a symbol of barbarism that needed to be civilized through Roman conquest. But archaeological evidence tells a much more complex story. Illyrian art from Teuta's period shows sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean artistic traditions, complex religious beliefs, and advanced technological capabilities. These weren't the cultural products of barbarians, they were the achievements of a civilization that was different from Rome but not necessarily inferior to it. The propaganda war also worked in reverse. Illyrian cultural traditions preserved stories of Teuta as a heroic defender of her people's freedom, a wise queen who understood that accommodation with Rome meant cultural extinction. These stories passed down through oral tradition, eventually influenced later resistance movements throughout the Balkans. Interestingly, modern popular culture has largely adopted the Roman perspective on Teuta, portraying her either as a villainous pirate queen or a tragic figure doomed by historical forces beyond her control. This probably says more about our own cultural biases than about historical accuracy, but it demonstrates how ancient propaganda continues to influence modern perceptions. Recent historical scholarship has begun to challenge the traditional narratives, suggesting that Teuta might be better understood as an early example of anti-imperial resistance rather than simple piracy. This reinterpretation reflects broader changes in how historians think about ancient conflicts between expanding empires and indigenous peoples. Now let's get technical for a moment and explore the practical aspects of how Teuta's piracy operations actually worked, because the logistics of ancient naval warfare were far more complex than most people realize. Operating an effective piracy network in the ancient Mediterranean required sophisticated knowledge of navigation, weather patterns, trade routes, and maritime law. First, there was navigation. Illyrian pirates had to track moving targets across hundreds of miles of open ocean using only wind patterns, star positions, and visual landmarks. This required navigational skills that were at least equal to those of the merchants they were hunting, plus the additional challenge of predicting where those merchants would be at specific times. Teuta's forces also had to understand seasonal trade patterns. Mediterranean commerce followed predictable cycles based on weather, agricultural seasons, and religious festivals. Grain ships from Egypt traveled at different times than wine ships from Gaul, and both followed routes that varied based on wind patterns and political conditions. This knowledge allowed Illyrian pirates to position themselves along trade routes at exactly the right times to intercept the most valuable cargoes. It was ancient logistics planning at its most sophisticated, requiring the kind of detailed intelligence gathering that would impress modern military planners. Weather prediction was equally crucial. Ancient Mediterranean sailing was entirely dependent on wind patterns, and successful piracy required understanding not just conditions, but future weather developments. Illyrian pirates had to predict when and where storms would drive merchant ships off course, creating opportunities for interception. They also had to understand the relationship between weather and Roman naval patrols. Roman warships followed predictable patterns based on seasonal conditions, and experienced pirates could avoid detection by timing their operations around Roman patrol schedules. The technical aspects of ship design were equally sophisticated. Illyrian Liburnians weren't just modified fishing boats, they were purpose-built warships designed for specific tactical requirements. Every aspect of their construction, from hull shape to sail configuration, was optimized for speed, maneuverability, and the ability to operate in shallow coastal waters. These ships also incorporated innovations that wouldn't become standard in other navies for decades. Reinforced steering systems allowed rapid directional changes. Multiple sail configurations provided maximum efficiency under different wind conditions. And specialized boarding equipment allowed crews to capture enemy vessels with minimum damage to valuable cargo. One aspect of Teuta's story that doesn't get enough attention is how she revolutionized diplomatic relations in the ancient Mediterranean. Traditional ancient diplomacy was based on personal relationships between rulers, sealed by marriages, hostage exchanges, and elaborate gift-giving ceremonies. Teuta developed a much more modern approach based on practical interest and strategic calculations. Her diplomatic innovation was treating piracy as a legitimate state activity that deserved international recognition. When Roman envoys demanded that she stop her people from enriching themselves at sea, she wasn't just being defiant. She was asserting that Illyrian maritime traditions deserve the same respect as Roman territorial claims. Now, this approach was revolutionary because it challenged the basic assumptions that governed ancient international relations. Traditional diplomacy assumed that civilized peoples, Greeks and Romans, had inherent rights that barbarian peoples, everyone else, were obligated to respect. Teuta rejected this hierarchy completely, insisting that Illyrian customs deserved equal consideration. Her diplomatic strategy also involved creating networks of mutual support with other Mediterranean powers that felt threatened by Roman expansion. Evidence suggests that she maintained relationships with Carthaginian agents, Egyptian merchants, and various Greek cities that saw Roman growth as a threat to their independence. These diplomatic relationships weren't just about military alliance, they were about creating alternative power structures that could challenge Roman hegemony. Teuta understood that Rome's strength came partly from its ability to isolate its enemies, preventing them from coordinating effective resistance. By building relationships with other anti-Roman forces, she was attempting to create what modern strategists would call a balance of power system that could limit Roman expansion through collective resistance. This strategy ultimately failed, but it demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international relations that was centuries ahead of its time. Now, in recent decades, archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of Teuta's Illyria, revealing a society that was far more sophisticated than ancient sources suggested. Excavations at sites like Razan, Skodra, and Lissus have uncovered evidence of urban planning, advanced metallurgy, and international trade relationships that paint a very different picture of Illyrian civilization. One of the most significant discoveries has been a series of inscriptions that mention Queen Teuta directly, providing contemporary evidence of her reign that doesn't depend on Roman or Greek sources. These inscriptions reveal a ruler who was involved in everything from religious ceremonies to trade regulations, suggesting a much more complex political role than a simple pirate queen. But perhaps most importantly, excavations have also revealed evidence of extensive maritime infrastructure that supported Teuta's naval operations. Hidden harbors, shipbuilding facilities, and coastal fortifications demonstrate that her piracy network was supported by sophisticated logistical systems that required significant planning and investment. These discoveries also reveal the extent of Illyrian trade relationships before the Roman conquest. Pottery, metalwork, and other artifacts show connections with communities throughout the whole entire Mediterranean, suggesting that Illyria was a major trading power in its own right, not just a collection of primitive tribes living off of piracy. Underwater archaeology has also been equally revealing. Shipwrecks from the period of Teuta's reign show evidence of both successful piracy and Roman naval responses. One wreck discovered off the coast of modern Montenegro appears to be a Roman merchant vessel that was captured and then sunk during a later battle, providing physical evidence of the conflict described in ancient sources. These underwater discoveries also reveal details about ancient naval combat that aren't preserved in written sources. Evidence of ramming damage, fire damage, and improvised repairs tell the story of a naval war that was far more destructive and prolonged than Roman historians admitted. So what should we make of Queen Teuta's extraordinary life and legacy? On one level, she was a ruler who understood her historical moment perfectly, recognizing that Roman expansion threatened not just an Illyrian independence, but the entire traditional structure of Mediterranean politics. Her response was both innovative and desperate, combining ancient traditions with revolutionary tactics in an attempt to preserve her people's way of life. On another level, she was a military and political genius who developed strategies that were centuries ahead of their time. Her use of economic warfare, asymmetric tactics, and international coalition building provided a template for resistance movements that would be used throughout history by smaller powers, challenging larger empires. But perhaps most importantly, Teuta represents something that's often missing from ancient history: proof that the rise of Rome wasn't inevitable, that intelligent opposition could force even the most powerful ancient state to adapt its strategies and change its approach to expansion. Her resistance forced Rome to become a different kind of empire than it might otherwise have been. The irony is that Teuta's defeat may have also been more historically significant than victory would have been. By forcing Rome to develop a new military, diplomatic, and administrative capabilities, she helped create the imperial system that would dominate the Mediterranean for the next 5 centuries. Her resistance made Rome stronger, but it also demonstrated that Roman power had limits and could be challenged by those clever enough to exploit Roman weaknesses. Today, Queen Teuta is remembered throughout the Balkans as a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. Streets, schools, and ships bear her name, and her story continues to inspire those who see parallels between ancient Roman expansion and modern forms of imperial power. Whether this modern interpretation reflects historical accuracy or contemporary political needs is debatable, but it demonstrates the enduring power of her example. In the end, Queen Teuta's greatest achievement may have been demonstrating that history is made by those who dare to challenge the inevitable. She couldn't prevent Roman expansion, but she proved that expansion could come at a cost, and that even the most powerful empires must adapt to survive determined opposition. Her story reminds us that behind every great imperial success lie the forgotten stories of those who refuse to accept that success as inevitable. Queen Teuta of Illyria, pirate, queen, and revolutionary, remains one of history's most fascinating examples of intelligence, courage, and the internal human refusal to surrender without a fight. The Mediterranean world was never quite the same after her brilliant, brief reign, and perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for a queen who dared to challenge Rome itself.